The depot was the beating heart of the little frontier town, a place where news traveled faster than any letter, where wagons came to rest after long journeys, and where folks gathered to gossip, bargain, and drink away the weariness of the trail. The late afternoon sun slanted low, painting the wooden boards of the platform with streaks of amber. Hooves clattered against dirt, men shouted over the hissing steam of an arriving train, and children darted between the skirts of their mothers, chasing one another with reckless abandon. But beneath the bustle, a different energy simmered, sharp, cruel, and aimed squarely at one woman who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. Clara kept her hands clasped at her waist, her back ramrod straight, and her chin lifted in a way that suggested strength. Yet inside, her chest quivered with each whispered word, each sidelong glance. She had grown used to it over the years, the way people in town thought her life an open wound to pick at, but familiarity did not dull the sting. Today it was worse than usual, for the women had gathered in a knot by the post near the general store, their voices loud enough to be carried by the evening breeze. "She's been married once, but no child came from it," one of them declared, her tone coated with that awful sweetness people used when they wanted their poison to sound like concern. "Not a one in all those years." "What's that tell you?" Another woman, tall and hawk-eyed, snorted. "Tells me she's barren as the desert. A man's got needs, and she couldn't give him what he wanted. No wonder he left." She folded her arms, her voice pitched higher so more ears would catch it. A ripple of laughter rose among them, light and cutting. Clara's fingers tightened around themselves, nails pressing crescent moons into her palms. She stared ahead at nothing, willing her body not to flinch. To show hurt here would be like bleeding in water thick with sharks. Nearby, a few men leaned against a wagon wheel, spitting tobacco and shaking their heads with grins that weren't kind. One of them muttered, "What's a woman worth if she can't keep a family going? Just another mouth to feed." The others chuckled, and the sound crawled over Clara's skin. She wanted to walk away, to put distance between herself and their words, but her pride rooted her in place. To retreat would be to admit their voices held power over her. So she stood, silent and steady, though her throat burned and her eyes stung. Then came the loudest laugh yet, from a plump woman fanning herself against the heat. Best she just accept her fate. Some women are meant to bear, and some aren't. She ain't. She waved her fan as if brushing Clara out of the air itself. Lonely spinster's life for her. The words echoed like a slap, and this time Clara did sway, just slightly, enough to draw a flicker of satisfaction from the onlookers. She swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. Her late nights spent weeping into pillows, her secret prayers whispered into darkness, all came crashing up against the laughter of that crowd. She had carried her sorrow in silence for so long, and here it was, made into entertainment. It might have gone on longer, the jeers and whispers growing sharper, if not for the heavy tread of boots cutting through the sound. From the far side of the depot, a figure stepped forward. Broad-shouldered, with the kind of gait that came from long hours in the saddle, a cowboy moved toward the knot of townsfolk, his shadow stretching across the boards as he came. His hat was pulled low, his jaw dark with stubble, and his eyes, when they lifted, glinted like steel catching sunlight. The crowd's laughter faltered as he drew closer. "That's enough," his voice rang out, deep and steady, cutting clean through the chatter. It wasn't shouted, yet it carried the weight of command, silencing even the boldest tongue. The women's fans stilled mid-wave, and the men shifted uneasily, glancing down at their boots. He stopped before them, his gaze sweeping the group, lingering on each face just long enough for discomfort to creep into their expressions. "Not a soul here's got the right to talk about what the Lord gives or what he withholds. You mock a woman for pain you don't even understand, and you call it truth. Shame on every last one of you." No one spoke. The only sounds were the restless stamping of horses and the hiss of the train cooling on the tracks. Some of the women dropped their eyes, their cheeks reddening. The men leaned back, muttering low but not daring to argue. Then the cowboy turned, his hard edges softening as his eyes found Clara. He reached out an arm, not commanding, not demanding, but offering. Clara hesitated. For a breath, she stood frozen, stunned that someone had stepped forward at all, much less someone like him. The crowd's eyes burned on her, expectant, waiting to see if she would accept. Her pride wavered, but not from shame, from the sudden warmth of being seen, defended. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand into the crook of his arm. The strength there was steady, unyielding, and for the first time that day, she felt shielded. The cowboy's presence drew a new round of whispers, but they were hushed now, wary. Together they walked past the knot of gossipers, Clara's back straightening with every step. The platform seemed to open before them, the hateful voices falling away behind like brittle leaves in the wind. Outside, beneath the wide sky streaked with fading gold, Clara finally drew in a deep breath, the air cool and clean in her lungs. She tilted her face toward the horizon, blinking away the wetness in her eyes before anyone could see. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, her voice catching despite her effort to keep it even. The cowboy looked down at her, his gaze steady but kind. "Maybe not, but I wasn't about to let them tear at you like that. You deserve better." Something in his tone, quiet, certain, lodged itself deep in her chest. She could only nod, afraid that if she spoke, the fragile control she held would crack. He gave her arm a gentle squeeze. "My place is out past the hills. It's quiet there. You could use some quiet, I reckon." The offer startled her, not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. Without pity, without presumption. Simply honest, as though he was offering her a safe harbor after a storm. Clara's lips parted, then closed. She searched his eyes, finding no mockery there, no judgment, only steady sincerity. Slowly, she nodded, and just like that, she let herself be led away from the depot, away from the voices that had made her pain into a spectacle. The last light of day bathed them both in gold as they stepped. The ranch lay far from town, tucked into the folds of rolling hills where tall grass swayed like waves beneath the wind. Clara had never been there before that evening when Silas brought her past the tree line, the sky bleeding purple and crimson over the horizon. His house stood plain and sturdy, built of rough timber, with smoke curling steady from the chimney. There was nothing fancy about it, but it carried a sense of belonging, as if the land itself held it close. When she stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the warmth, the fire humming in the hearth, the scent of pine logs burning, the faint sweetness of bread cooling on the table. It had been a long time since any place felt like home. Silas didn't fuss over her or try to fill the silence. He simply set her bag down near the hearth and went about his tasks, stoking the fire, pouring water into the basin, setting out a chair for her as though she'd always belonged there. Clara sat, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching him move with an ease that unsettled her in the strangest way. She had grown used to being overlooked, to feeling like a shadow in other people's lives. Yet here was a man making space for her without asking anything in return. Days turned into weeks before Clara realized how much the ranch had softened the ache in her chest. She rose early, helping with chores, her skirts brushing dew from the grass as she fed the chickens or gathered eggs. Sometimes Silas would be out in the pastures, his broad frame cutting a figure against the pale morning, and she'd watch him drive the cattle with quiet authority. When he returned, he never boasted about his work. He'd simply ask how her morning went, his voice calm, as if her thoughts mattered just as much as his labor. At first, Clara kept her words short, afraid of saying too much, but slowly her tongue loosened. She told him about the books she used to read as a girl, about the way her mother taught her to embroider by lamplight, about how she still prayed each night though she wasn't sure if anyone was listening. He listened as though every word carried weight. No one had ever done that before, not her neighbors, not her late husband, not the women at the depot. Silas never looked away when she spoke, his gaze anchored her, steadied her. And when laughter came, soft, hesitant at first, it surprised her. She had thought laughter had abandoned her years ago, but Silas drew it out gently, with wry remarks and quiet humor. Once, when she dropped an egg and muttered about her clumsiness, he simply leaned against the fence and said, "Guess that chicken was bound to cause trouble one way or another," and the chuckle that escaped her lips startled her so much she pressed a hand over her mouth. He only smiled, as if he'd found what he was looking for. The house began to change, too. Clara's touch filled it slowly, a sprig of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, neat stitches repairing the curtains, the smell of her baking mingling with the pine smoke. Silas never commented, but his eyes softened when he came in from the fields to find soup simmering or shirts mended. He acted as if her presence was not an intrusion but a gift. It was in that space of quiet, steady care that something unexpected took root. Clara, who had long carried the label of barren, felt her body shift in ways she scarcely believed possible. She dismissed it at first, telling herself she was imagining things, that it was foolish to hope. But as the weeks stretched into months, her certainty grew. The morning sickness, the heaviness low in her belly, the tenderness she had only once before dared to dream of, it was real this time. She sat alone one dawn, the firelight flickering over her pale hands, her heart trembling with a mixture of fear and wonder. All those cruel words from the depot rushed back to her, the laughter of women who had said she would never bear, never hold a child of her own. She pressed a hand against her stomach, tears sliding down her cheeks, whispering to herself, "Lord, please let this be true." When Silas entered, brushing the chill from his coat, he saw her there by the fire, her eyes shining with something he couldn't yet name. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing gently against her arm. "Clara, what is it?" Her voice broke as she spoke. "Silas, I think I'm with child." For a moment, time stilled. His rag dropped from his hand, forgotten on the floor. His eyes widened, then softened, and in an instant he was gathering her against him. His embrace was fierce, his breath shaky against her hair. "Clara, oh, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You don't know what this means to me. To us." She clung to him, weeping, not from sorrow but from joy she had long thought lost. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in one another, the fire crackling around them, the world beyond the walls slipping away. The months that followed tested them both. Clara's body grew heavier, her back ached, her moods shifted like the winds over the plains. Yet Silas never faltered. He carried water, he cooked when she was too weary, he sat beside her at night rubbing the knots from her shoulders with his calloused hands. When fear crept in, whispering that something might go wrong, his steady voice reminded her, "We'll face it together, no matter what." And when the day of labor came, when the house filled with the sound of Clara's cries, Silas never let go of her hand. He spoke to her in low, steady tones, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, his strength anchoring her through the storm of pain. Hours passed, the sun arched high and then fell again, until at last a newborn's wail pierced the room. Clara collapsed against the pillows, tears streaking her face, her chest heaving. The midwife placed the child in her arms, and Clara gazed down at the tiny, wriggling body, her heart bursting. She had thought she'd never feel this weight, never hear this cry, never know this love. But here it was, alive and warm against her chest. Silas sat beside her, his rough hand trembling as it touched the baby's cheek. His eyes shone with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Clara, he's perfect, you're perfect." Word traveled back to town, as word always did. At the depot, whispers stirred like dry leaves, astonishment, disbelief, a few grudging admissions of error. But Clara never returned there seeking their approval. She stayed at the ranch, cradling her child in the glow of the firelight, her heart full. She had nothing left to prove to them. She had proved it to herself, and to the man who had stood beside her when no one else would. In that quiet house on the prairie, with her baby nestled against her and Silas watching over them with pride, Clara finally let the past fall away. The cruel laughter of the depot was nothing now but a faint echo, swallowed by the sound of her child's breathing, by the steady rhythm of a family born not of the world's judgment, but of love and grace. Winter had given way to spring when Clara first walked back into town with her child swaddled close against her chest. The air was alive with the smell of thawing earth, the grass just beginning to green, and birds darting from rooftop to rooftop as though the whole world celebrated the change of season. She hadn't intended to return so soon, but Silas needed supplies, grain for the cattle, nails for mending the barn, flour for bread, and Clara insisted she could handle the trip. Part of her longed to face those voices again, though the thought made her heart pound like a frightened drum. She carried her baby carefully, his small breaths warm against her collarbone. Each tiny movement reminded her that the miracle was real, that she was no longer the woman mocked as barren but a mother, cradling living proof of grace and endurance. The walk into the depot was slower than usual, but Silas matched her step, one steady hand at the small of her back. The town looked much the same as before, wagons rattling down the road, men unloading crates, women gathered in clusters exchanging news with quick tongues. Yet when Clara stepped onto the platform, the chatter faltered. Heads turned, fans stilled, even the laughter that usually bubbled around the depot dwindled into a hush. The same women who had once sneered now stared with wide eyes, their gazes fixed. Not on Clara's face but on the bundle in her arms. Clara's pulse raced. For a moment, she thought of turning back, but Silas gave her hand a subtle squeeze. She drew herself tall, lifting her chin, and shifted the blanket just enough to reveal the sleeping infant within. A faint gasp rippled through the onlookers. "That's her child," someone whispered, the words carrying louder than they meant. Clarice, the plump woman who had fanned herself so boldly the last time, stood near the post again, her mouth falling open as if she had seen a ghost. But she couldn't, she began, only to falter under the weight of the sight before her. Clara said nothing. She let the silence do the speaking, the tiny rise and fall of her child's chest louder than any words she could summon. She felt no need to gloat, no hunger for revenge. The child was enough, her vindication, her proof, her joy. Still, it gave her a quiet satisfaction to see the color rise in their cheeks, the certainty of their judgments crumbling like dry clay. Silas stepped forward then, his presence as unyielding as it had been that day months ago. "You all remember your words," he said evenly, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "And now you see the truth. She doesn't owe you explanation, nor apology. She never did, but I reckon you all owe her some shame for how you treated her." No one dared reply. A few lowered their heads. Others turned away, their tongues suddenly still. The depot, once so full of ridicule, now felt subdued, as though the walls themselves blushed at the memory of what they had witnessed. Clara moved past them, her steps light despite the weight she carried in her arms. She went into the general store, bought what she needed, and walked out again with her child still sleeping soundly. The whispers had resumed, but they were different now, soft, uncertain, tinged with awe instead of scorn. She caught fragments. "A miracle, never thought, maybe we were wrong." Outside, Clara paused by the hitching post, letting the sunlight warm her face. She looked down at her son, brushing a fingertip against his tiny hand. His fingers curled instinctively around hers, and her throat tightened with emotion. She thought back to the nights when she had wept alone, convinced she would never hold a child of her own. Those nights seemed distant now, like shadows fading at dawn. Silas came to her side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You held your head higher than any of them could, Clara," he murmured. "I'm proud of you." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "I don't think it's pride I feel. Just peace. They can say what they will. I have what I prayed for." She looked back down at the baby, her voice softening. "And I'll never let him hear a word of their cruelty." They left town together, the wagon wheels crunching against the dirt road as they made their way back toward the ranch. The hills rose to meet them, the air sweeter the farther they went, the town's bitterness left behind like a trail of smoke. At home, Clara laid her child in a cradle Silas had built by hand, the wood smooth and strong, the edges rounded by care. She sat beside it, watching her baby's chest rise and fall, her heart swelling with gratitude until it felt too large for her body. Days melted into months, and life on the ranch grew richer. Clara found herself humming as she worked, songs she hadn't sung since girlhood spilling back into her memory. The baby's laughter filled the rooms, a sound brighter than any hymn she had ever known. Silas would come in from the fields, weary and dust-streaked, only to kneel beside the cradle and let his son wrap tiny fists around his finger. He would look up at Clara then, eyes brimming with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe this life was theirs. The seasons turned, each one weaving them closer together. Summer brought heat and the scent of wildflowers, autumn painted the hills in fire, winter wrapped them in quiet, and through it all the child grew strong, his first steps cheered, his first words treasured. Clara carried him against her hip as she went about her chores, never tiring of the warmth of his small body against hers. Every glance, every laugh, every tear reminded her of the miracle she had once been told would never be hers. On nights when the stars stretched endless above the prairie, Clara would stand in the doorway with Silas beside her, the child asleep inside. The cool wind would brush her cheeks, and she would whisper to herself, "I proved them wrong." But more than that, she had proved herself right, to keep believing, to keep hoping, to keep walking forward even when others tried to break her. The depot's voices no longer haunted her. They were nothing but echoes now, meaningless against the sound of her son's laughter and the steady rhythm of Silas's love. She had found her place in the world, not in the cruel judgments of others, but in the quiet strength of a home built with kindness, in the arms of a man who saw her worth, and in the small heartbeat that had forever changed her life.